Hello, thank you for inviting me to present on this topic. I'm happy to be here today. Here's a topic that's often asked about and certainly comes up with my clients as well. So I'm pleased to be presenting today on navigating dating and relationships after brain injury. A few things to take care of first. I have no disclosures. And then hopefully following the presentation, you'll be able to understand the potential for changes that will take place after a brain injury, appreciate the importance of communication in both new and existing relationships, and exploring more about that personal decision of how much or when to disclose information when meeting new people. And finally, hopefully healthcare providers will learn some ways to open up this conversation with their patients and clients and help families that would like to learn more information on dating and relationships. So I wanted to start with sharing a bit about me and why I came to be presenting on this topic. I started my career with lifespan neuropsychological assessment and concussion management. And with that, it was very much focused on the short term, shortly after a concussion happened, returning someone back to their regular activities, and took place soon after injury. Then when I started working at Bancroft Neurorehab, I began treating individuals with acquired brain injury who reside in our residential programs, and the psychological treatment was very much long-term and was starting or taking place continuing long after the injury. So in this different setting, I began having these dating, relationship conversations with clients and with their teams. It became a clear area of need, and both the clients and the staff wanted more guidance. So to give a brief overview of what we'll talk about today, I'm going to start with relationship rights and responsibilities, talk a bit about how to get ready to date, exploring what you're looking for, what a relationship might mean to you. Then we'll get into the trickier question of how much information to disclose and when to do so, some online dating safety. I'll discuss some relationship interventions that have been helpful for couples, and then how to talk to your providers, how to bring up these questions, and hopefully start the conversation. All right. So it's an area of overlooked importance in the rehabilitation world. People want something to do, somewhere to live, someone to love. And yet, these intimate relationships or sexual relationships are among the highest areas of dissatisfaction after a brain injury. We know that having a romantic relationship can contribute to a higher quality of life for folks. And survivors report that their need for intimacy was unmet, was overlooked as part of their rehabilitation. And a little bit more about myself. I was trained in both cognitive behavioral therapy and some psychodynamic training as part of my program. So I do like to go back to this quote from Freud that when he was asked, what is most important? Like, what is psychologically most important? He said, love and work. Love and work are the cornerstones of our humanness. And I think in the rehab world, we do a great job of focusing on work. We're not as sure about how to focus on the love part. I wanted to start with rights. I like to ground the discussions of dating, of relationships in an individual's right when I'm doing my work, because we can certainly kind of get caught up in our worries about this, what might not go well, but we want to remember that individuals do have a right to form relationships. So some of the human rights that might interplay with a relationship or with sexual health include things like right to equality and non-discrimination, right to privacy, right to the highest attainable standard of health As we were saying on the next slide, that having a relationship might actually contribute towards more health, towards more quality of life. The right to marry and found a family with consent of both parties involved. Also, the right to end that marriage if they choose. The right to information and education, and the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And of course, we remember that the responsible exercise of human rights requires that we respect the human rights of others as well. Going along with rights, I get asked questions about consent too, consent or possibly capacity. There may be some concerns about, is the person able to go through all their options to really think about this? So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Consent is getting a yes that's freely chosen without any lies or threats or pressure or coercion. And when we're talking about someone's capacity, their ability to consent, it's been defined as really relying on three principles: rationality, knowledge, and voluntariness. And those three mean, rationality means that the person is able to weigh their options, to understand what the options are, to have the ability to make a choice based on thinking through some pros and cons. And then the knowledge is that education piece, knowledge. Do they understand about relationships? If they're interested in sexual activity, do they understand about this sexual act and what that means? And then the last part, voluntary, are they free to choose? Again, without any coercion. So when we're asking, can someone consent? Do they have the capacity? Capacity, at the end of the day, is a legal term, is something that you may have a doctor or psychologist weigh in on. But when we're talking through it, we want to say, if the person can weigh their options, make a choice, are free to choose, then they likely are able to have that capacity. And in New Jersey, because it is state specific, in New Jersey, the standard for consent is that the adult individual must understand the sexual nature of the act, and their decision to engage is entirely voluntary. All right, so for opening up the dating conversation, beginning with interest in dating, these are some resources that I've used in helping clients who are beginning to look into this. The first one is not meant to be patronizing in any way. It is designed for parents and teachers to talk about these topics with youth, but I find the language is very helpful, and it can give you some good framework to bring up sensitive topics that you might be hesitant to bring up or not sure how to word it. I found this very helpful for thinking through some of those dating conversations, or thinking and talking about some concerns that maybe parents or loved ones or teens might be having. The second one answers some questions in like a FAQ format that women with disabilities might have as they're navigating intimate relationships. It is geared toward women. And the last one is some general online safety tips for avoiding scams and generally keeping your privacy, keeping safe online, because there's a lot of things out there and it changes frequently. So it can be good to just have a basis in online safety if you're going the route of possibly online dating sites to meet people. All right, so what are some things I talk about if someone is interested in a relationship, even before they've started, before they've met anyone, we can have some conversations about how they might be getting ready, how they might be thinking about this to better prepare. So as we're first getting started, we want to think in general of like, how do you make a good impression on others that you're meeting for the first time? How do you express an interest in them and share what you are interested in? We might go over communication styles as just a general intro to getting to know any new person. Do you use some assertive communication, like facing them, making eye contact, using a good tone of voice, being willing to start the conversation or ask questions rather than always waiting for the other person to speak? Maybe someone's more on the passive or shy side of the communication style and may need some help with some of these factors. Maybe they're hesitant to make eye contact or start the conversation. So how can we help them get more confident? Or maybe they're on the more aggressive side. Maybe they're talking too loudly or talking too much about themselves without listening to the other person. So how to help them pull back on that a bit so that they can really get to know someone else. Also thinking through like what are you looking for? It's a broad question, but like what are you looking for in a relationship? What would make a healthy relationship for you? There's some good basic tenets to look at, like respect, trust, fairness, equality, good communication. And then also like let's list some red flags. Let's think about like what might come up that could be a sign that this isn't healthy or isn't going to be good. Is it disrespect or jealousy or refusal to compromise, difficulty communicating, things like that, to have in mind before you get sort of caught up in a relationship, and then it can be harder to see these things. Also things to think through for yourself beforehand or talk with someone about if you're starting to develop an interest, if you're starting to get into a relationship. What are your feelings about commitment and level of commitment? What are your feelings about physical touch and what is going to be good for you or feels right for you? How much time are you going to spend together? How often? These can all be talked about rather than assumed. Also, wanted to touch on also, like, we have a lot of cultural, societal assumptions about how a relationship should go, how it should progress. We have these narratives from our lives, from media, from people we know, that you're sort of supposed to go from dating to exclusivity to engagement to marriage, possibly to having a family, and we feel like it has to progress this way, or maybe we're not doing it right or something. But there's really no rule that relationships have to follow this one pattern. You're free to decide what a fulfilling relationship means to you. So we could start with asking some questions or doing some work on your own of like, what do I really want? Examining what are some of the should statements, like I should be doing this by now, versus what you would actually want or what would actually make you happy. We also have to acknowledge in this field, and I acknowledge with my clients, that maybe some of what you want is going to be not so easy to do. I have some folks in our residential program that are dating, partnered, have been together a while, are very happy with each other, would maybe like to live together, but they both have very high assistance needs. They live in residential staffed settings, and living together may not be an option, or maybe like a very difficult option. So talking through what that looks like or what that would mean to them. Some people have financial concerns. If you're going to the step of marriage, you need to consider, like, that would be a joint income then. How would that maybe impact some benefits you're receiving through disability or Social Security or insurance? So some of the kind of not as fun things to think about too, but may need to be a consideration as you're making your plans. And these may come up for families too. The families or the teams in our residential setting may have some worries about a developing relationship, may bring these up, like, well, what have they considered all these financial or living together, how this would work. So we want to sort of bring all this to the table so we can talk through how it might work, what we could do. All right, I wanted to spend some time on this disclosure question because this is a big one that comes up. Is when you're meeting new people, should I tell them I've had a brain injury? Should I disclose medical needs or assistance needs? Should I say if I don't drive or don't work anymore, what will the person think? We're trying to figure out how much to say and when to say it so that you're giving some information about yourself, but also managing fears about the other person's reaction or rejection. So to help us understand this question, I looked into a survey article, have references at the end of the presentation as well, about how others with disabilities, this was people who identified as individuals with disabilities, not necessarily brain injury, how they went about disclosure in online dating specifically. So first, just to kind of have everyone take a breath here, online dating is stressful and awkward to navigate in general. So it is, it is an undertaking for most people. There's many options for online data sites. I don't have specific recommendations. I feel like that's not really within my purview. I haven't vetted sites or things like that. But I know from talking with folks that there's many general dating sites. There's some that are specific to individuals with disability or individuals with brain injury specifically. So it's also about sort of looking at what you might want to try, or maybe try several. All right, so to get to the survey, so they surveyed adults with and without disabilities who were using online data platforms, and they had two main findings. The participants preferred that individuals with immediately noticeable disabilities disclose them upfront. And also, participants used self-disclosure to filter out potentially ableist dating matches. So they're acknowledging that in the online dating world, you have greater control about what is disclosed and when. However, they were expressing that they did want to know upfront if something would be immediately noticed upon meeting this person in the real world. Several said that this was because the disclosure could help them better plan for an in-person date and consider accessibility options. Others expressed that it just seemed dishonest to conceal something online that would be immediately apparent. However, which leaves us in the BI world in a bit of a tricky situation still, the survey indicated that those with invisible disabilities could wait to disclose until maybe they've talked to the person for a while, messaged for a while, or even met in person. They didn't have that need to disclose up front. So that leaves us a little stuck still, because often brain injury is called the invisible disability. So it could help to explore that second point, their second finding from their survey participants with a disability. A very high proportion of them used disclosure to filter out potentially ableist matches. They expressed wanting to weed out potential matches who would react negatively upon finding out about their disability or their medical or their assistance needs. They wanted to just minimize that rejection, minimize that harm to themselves, and not match in the first place. Others indicated it would be a waste of time and energy to pursue a match that was going to leave them later. So they used the disclosure to sort of filter through folks that would continue to be interested. So while we're talking about online, I wanted to bring up some points about online dating safety. Again, we want to come back to the rights and the safety considerations. People have rights to pursue relationships, and we also want to try to do it without unnecessary risk. So I encourage people to have a game plan, have a basis in general online safety tips, things that are always good to review, as we're getting, so many of us are getting spam calls, spam emails, someone's always out for getting your information. So we do want to be careful, go over some of the basics, like never give out your full name or your date of birth or your address, passwords, financial information, etc. Keep all those private. Be very careful with sending pictures. Once the picture is sent, you can't control it anymore. That other person could copy it, could send it to whomever. So be very careful about sending them. Only send ones that you wouldn't mind being in the public domain. Be careful, there's just so many scams. It's really unfortunate. We've probably all experienced a few ourselves of scam calls and phishing for information and things like that. So I do really encourage people to talk about who you're meeting. Kind of feel it out with your good friends and family, pay attention if something feels off. You may be caught up in the excitement of it, but maybe someone close to you is like, that sounds a little fishy. Can we get a little more information? Just to help pay attention to that before something were to happen. And then if it gets to the point of meeting in person, again, considering some safety considerations, like choose a public place. Maybe don't invite them to like your home address for the first time, but choose a public meeting space. Tell someone where you'll be. Maybe set up like a check-in phone call partway through the date, things like that. Or even consider bringing someone with you to meet this person. And I want to normalize this piece too. Like as we're talking about dating in general, it's like let's normalize having sort of a safety plan like that and letting others know where you are. And if the person really like reacts strongly to that or rejects that, that could maybe be a sign too. They, hopefully if they are going to be interested in you and continuing to see you, they'd want you to feel safe and comfortable. All right, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit to communication. And let's say you're starting a new relationship, or maybe these can also be helpful. Maybe you're in an established relationship, but it needs a little help. So some common elements in couples therapy following brain injury include psychoeducation about potential cognitive or emotional difficulties, emotional support for both partners, problem solving, self-regulation and coping skills, increasing empathy, and increasing the positive communication. So there's some possible areas of difficulty after BI that could affect relationships. Someone may be experiencing physical changes. They might have difficulty getting around or pain or fatigue that could impact them being able to get out there with somebody else. There could be a variety of cognitive changes, difficulties with language or communication, or difficulties giving or receiving nonverbal communication. The executive planning piece can really weigh heavily on things like dating, because you're setting up plans, you're trying to attend to and remember facts the person's sharing about themselves. If there's memory or attention problems, the other person may misinterpret that as low interest or not paying attention. And then we have either impulsivity, maybe going too fast, or low initiation. If someone has trouble sort of getting up the initiation to make that first phone call or make the first suggestion for a date, it might be interpreted in a certain way that that the survivor did not mean for it to be. There could also be emotional changes. Someone may have difficulty with mood regulation. They may be suffering from depression or anxiety, which again could play into like low initiation or, planning difficulties. And they may have a short temper, trouble regulating, or trouble reading the other person's subtle emotional cues. So people are really looking for that like emotional attunement. I wanted to touch on too some potential areas of stress that could exist on an existing relationship, a relationship that maybe began before the brain injury and is going to continue after, but then both partners are dealing with things like ambiguous loss, possibly a personality change in one of the partners, changes in roles in their relationship or within their family, and maybe someone identified as the breadwinner or the head of the household, and now they're not in that role anymore. Or maybe they were the caretaker of children and now someone's taking care of them. It can be quite a shock to change those responsibilities. Depression could be experienced by either or both partners, or the change in dependence or caretaking responsibilities on the non-injured partner could be weighing on the relationship. So as we're looking toward what helps in these sort of situations, one of the articles, which is at the end, if you want to look further into it, is using emotionally focused couples therapy for survivors. And they again talk about how a breakdown in intimacy in romantic relationships is common. Those cognition and executive functioning and emotional functioning impairments can impact the relationship, as we were just talking about. And they found that a big sort of pressure point for the relationships was that the emotional dysregulation could lead the survivor to either exhibiting too much emotion, being seen as overreacting, or too little, being seen as underreacting, maybe not caring enough. And then that can lead to the non-injured partner to either feel sort of wary, on guard, like, oh, I don't want to, I'm sort of stepping on eggshells, I don't want to do anything that will create a reaction, or feeling unheard, like feeling like I just disclosed something really big to my partner and they were sort of like, oh, well, they didn't share that like emotional degree with me, and they wanted to feel heard in that moment. So they describe in this article that these emotional and cognitive regulation difficulties can lead to cycles of withdrawal. So maybe if one partner has big, strong reactions, the other partner kind of withdraws and said, okay, I'm going to try not to set them off. I'm going to withdraw. And then they're getting less positive communication, less positive time together. Or again, if one of the partners is sort of underregulated, like they're not giving a lot of emotion or initiation themselves, it may just again lead to withdrawal, like, well, they're not really talking much or giving me much anyway, gonna sort of back away. So we need to sort of step in and change that cycle. And the helpful elements from the emotionally focused couples therapy were to really explicitly in the sessions clarify each partner's intentions and each partner's perspectives. So giving them a chance to say, when I didn't respond to you the other day, it wasn't that I didn't care. It was maybe I didn't know what to say, or I was so overwhelmed that I retreated. So we can talk about that so we can get more clarity on what the intentions were. They do work on enhancing empathy, putting each partner in the other's shoes, taking the other's perspective to hear how it was like for them, to better emotionally connect again, and help with recognizing when withdrawal is starting to happen. So they look at the patterns for the couples and say, like, when this starts to go down this path, we need to come back to communicating rather than letting that worsen. And they give support and coping skills for both partners to use. All right, so in the final piece here, I'll be talking about how to talk to healthcare providers and how healthcare providers can reach out and start these conversations with their patients and clients to hopefully be helpful in this area. So when we're thinking about who can help lots of people can help. Many providers are positioned to talk about aspects of dating or relationships. Could be a speech therapist, occupational therapist, social worker, certainly the psychologists among us. But if someone has goals of communication and speech, you could put that into a setting of meeting new people or what you might say on a date or things like that. So interestingly, there was, again, I looked into a survey of several different healthcare providers. They surveyed speech therapists, occupational therapists, case managers, social workers, and psychologists, asked them their views on dating for their rehabilitation clients. And most agreed, yes, dating's important. Relationships are very important to the quality of life. But then when they were asked, is it your role to do so? Few agreed with that part of it. They didn't think it was their role. And even among psychologists, only 50% in this survey felt confident that they had the knowledge to address dating concerns. So even though a lot of times they say, well, let's get psychology or social work to help with this, we're hesitant too. So what can we do to be more confident and hopefully answer some questions that are really burning questions for people? Again, want to normalize. This is hard. This is hard to talk about. It's not that we don't care or we don't recognize that it's important, but professionals find it hard to talk about. They feel like they lack the training to discuss relationship issues. They're not really prioritized during rehab. There's often a goal to, we got to get your ADLs in order. We got to do return to school or return to work first. Again, we're sort of prioritizing that work role, which is in some ways easier to think about, has some more concrete steps to it, certainly, than a relationship. So that tends to be targeted in the rehabilitation programs. And people do find the topic embarrassing, or they worry, this is overly personal or intrusive. What is my patient going to think if I ask them that? They worry about embarrassing themselves or embarrassing the patient. So instead they just keep quiet about it. Also, providers, since we're helpers, we're always on the lookout for people. We tend to overemphasize the risks, overemphasizing possible harm that someone could feel from rejection or from this not going well, overemphasizing the vulnerability to scams. But as we were talking about before, I wouldn't want to take away someone's rights to possibly have a fulfilling relationship. Certainly there's safety things to talk about, but we can make a plan for that too. So to help us better talk about this, there's a model called the explicit model for addressing sexual well-being. It was made by Taylor and Davis, 2007, the citations at the end of the presentation. And the term PLICIT stands for permission, limited information, specific suggestions, and then intensive therapy. So this starts with permission. Healthcare providers giving the individual permission to discuss sexuality and relationships instead of waiting for the individual to raise the topic. Sometimes healthcare providers, again, because we're a little uneasy, we're like, well, they'll bring it up to us if it's a problem. But that's not really the case. If the provider doesn't bring it up, individuals may assume that it's not appropriate to talk about. So we want to give sort of a normalizing question. Maybe you could say something like, many people with this condition have concerns about how it affects their relationship or how it affects their sexual life. What are your concerns? So just opening up the question. And it's a little broader than do you have concerns? Because then the person may easily be like, no, but this says, what are your concerns? It kind of pulls them to bring up what they're going through. The next stage after the permission opening question is providing limited information. So providing just some general information about what the individual could be experiencing based on their health history or based on their concerns. You could provide some general resources on relationships or sexual health to kind of help them get started. Or specific suggestions. Maybe if they come with a very particular concern, you could gather more information about that, use their health history to inform a suggestion that you may have for them. And then the last step is intensive therapy. And I find this one is important because I think some of why the question isn't asked in the first place is that providers worry, what if this goes beyond what I know? What if this goes beyond my competency? And then I've sort of opened a can of worms. But we don't have to not broach the question, because there is always room to refer the individual to someone else that might have that competency. So if there's very serious relationship problems that are coming up, you may refer them to psychologists or counselors that specialize in relationships. Maybe they have more of a physical concern with their sexual functioning, so they could be referred to another medical provider, gynecology or urology, to address a more specific physical concern. So it doesn't mean you don't, you still ask the question and then try to get them the appropriate referrals for their needs. Another part too is once you've asked once, to do some follow-up, ask if their needs continue to be met, because we might also have that sense of like, okay, I asked, I did it, I overcame my embarrassment and asked. But you want to follow up too. This involves further permission giving to discuss what may have worked or not worked out for that client since your last meeting, to do some further problem solving about that. And providers too are encouraged to reflect on their own attitudes or assumptions that they may be holding about sexuality or relationships for individuals with disabilities. If you're really uncomfortable talking about it, it might be helpful to kind of explore why, or maybe role play a bit with a colleague about how you might start that conversation or how you might answer someone's questions, so you can gain some comfort with it. I provided some suggestions too on possible therapy goals for dating. As we were saying, there's many providers and therapists that could help with different aspects of this. So they could target some goals to maybe those interaction styles we were talking about, like assertive communication, communication strategies to really fully explain feelings, requests, how to be stating your needs clearly and communicating with others. There could be an education piece, gathering more information about healthy relationships, about appropriateness of potential partners. Sometimes that one comes up too, like who would be an appropriate partner in terms of age or relationship to you. Further education about sexual health or safer sex practices, exploring values and what you're looking for in a partner. There could be some behavioral intervention, maybe addressing someone's impulsivity or disinhibited behavior so that they can better present when they're meeting someone new, or addressing low initiation, or addressing social anxiety if that's keeping them at home as they're too nervous in a social setting. So these could all be therapy targets to help with anxiety, initiation, what have you, to get someone into a social space. Managing and normalizing rejection in the dating process. As I was saying on the online dating slide, like this is really hard and awkward for everybody. So if it doesn't work the first time or the first several times, that's okay. And it doesn't mean that you'll never find someone or things like that, to keep helping with their expectations around that. You could do specific education on safety for online or in-person interactions. Come up with that game plan with someone. Or maybe even the logistics of accessing the data sites, meeting their accessibility needs if they need some help getting online, or the logistics piece of things. So these could all be potentially used in a variety of therapies if this is someone's goal and something they very much want to work towards. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today and letting me speak about this topic. It's become an interest of mine. Provided some references at the end here of those surveys and studies I was talking about throughout the presentation. And I believe the slides will be available to you as well. And here is my contact information if you'd like to email me and ask any questions you may have. I look forward to hearing from you. And again, thank you so much for your time today.